Welcome historians to my channel Told Stories. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share. This helps a lot with the video's reach. Without further delay, let's get into it. Venezuela, a country of immense natural wealth, has lived through centuries of glory and tragedy. Its history is marked by independence, oil, and, more recently, by a crisis that culminated in the capture of Nicolás Maduro in 2026, who colonized Venezuela. Venezuela was colonized by Spain starting in the 16th century. The first expedition to land on South American territory was commanded by the Italian Christopher Columbus, who reached the Gulf of Paria and set foot on Venezuelan lands on August 5, 1498. In this first contact, the islands were more targeted, especially Cabagua Island, which became very important to the colonial economy due to pearl production. A year after Columbus's arrival, Spanish navigator Alonso de Ojeda, accompanied by Amerigo Vespucci, began exploring the interior of continental Venezuela through the Orinoco River, the longest and most important waterway in the country. Although these are the most well-known names, several European expeditions passed along Venezuela's coast between the late 15th and early 16th centuries. However, it was only in 1523 that the first Spanish settlement was established in Venezuela Cumana, a city in the state of Sucre, in the north of the country, about 400 kilometers from today's capital. Caracas. Cumana was not only the first Venezuelan city, but it is also known as the first permanent Spanish settlement in the Americas. It is said that this was the moment when Spanish colonization officially began in Venezuela. Before becoming a colony, however, Venezuela was not uninhabited. On the contrary, numerous indigenous peoples lived in Venezuelan territory, each with their own social organization and way of life. Among them were the Caribs, Arawaks, Chibchus, Timotoquicas, Guayquerias, Maricha, and Yanomami, the latter also present in Brazil. There was strong indigenous resistance to the violent incursions of Europeans in Venezuela, but these peoples eventually went through processes of cultural erasure and acculturation through the imposition of European traditions. Even so, indigenous influences survived and can still be identified today in Venezuela's rich culture. Chapter 1. Independence. As happened with neighboring countries, Venezuela remained a Spanish colony for about 3 centuries. During this time, agriculture and enslaved labor brought from Africa formed the basis of its economy. From the 17th century onward, cocoa was added to the colony's product basket alongside corn, beans, sugarcane, and tobacco, reinforcing Venezuela's agrarian export economy. For a brief period, the English and French managed to trade with Venezuela, but Spain established a monopoly in the colony in the 18th century with the creation of the Royal Japuz-Cohen Company of Caracas. It was precisely against this company that one of the revolts against the Spanish crown took place, led by Juan Francisco de Leon, lasting from 1866 to 1868. By the end of the 18th century, other revolts were recorded in the colony, fueling feelings of independence and sovereignty among its inhabitants. Venezuela's socio-political context was influenced by the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the French invasion of Spain at the beginning of the 19th century, which culminated in the deposition of King Ferdinand VII in 1808, deepening the crisis in the metropolis. Because of this, Venezuela declared independence on July 5, 1811, founding the First Republic. However, this movement marked the beginning of internal revolution with successive attempts by Spanish colonizers to regain power. During this period of great political turmoil, one of the most important figures emerged for the independence of Venezuela, as well as Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and Simón Bolívar. Numerous battles were fought between Bolívarist troops and the Spanish royalist forces. In 1813, he managed to defeat the Spaniards and founded the Second Venezuelan Republic. However, the Europeans were determined to fully regain control of their colony and defeated Bolívar that same year. Bolívar fled to Jamaica in 1815 and, under threat of death, moved again this time to Haiti, while continuing to support the independence of Spanish colonies in South America. His return to Venezuela was marked by the founding of the Third Republic in 1817 and the creation of Gran Colombia 2 years later. In Ibaizú, with Bolívar as president of this new territory, gradually, this political administrative union dissolved, and in 1830, Venezuela separated and gained its current territorial configuration, who governed Venezuela before Hugo Chávez. Before Hugo Chávez was elected president of Venezuela and came to power in 1999. The mandate immediately preceding his was Rafael Caldera's, who assumed the presidency in 1994. Caldera had already led the country's executive branch in the early 1970s, when he was first elected president, and was recognized for politically pacifying Venezuela after a period of intense ideological disputes. At the time, it is said that balance was achieved even within the National Assembly through better distribution of party mandates in the legislature. Shortly before Caldera's return to the presidency, Venezuela experienced a political and social crisis caused by economic measures implemented by Carlos Andrés Pérez. In an attempt to liberalize the economy, the late 1980s, more broadly, were marked by the spread of Washington consensus measures and the wider propagation of neoliberal ideals across Latin America. Also during his second term 1989 to 1993, Perez contracted loans from the International Monetary Fund (IMF), while simultaneously devaluing the Venezuelan currency and cutting public spending. This directly affected the population with rising food and transportation costs. Popular discontent led to protests across the country, including in the capital, which were met with intense police repression. This popular uprising was called the Caracazo and occurred in 1989. Within the armed forces, fragmented politically and ideologically, a movement emerged that culminated in an attempted coup against Perez and Ijo Joar. The leader of the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 2000, who headed the failed coup attempt, was Hugo Chavez. All those involved were arrested, including Chavez. His release occurred during Caldera's government, which allowed him to fully enter political life. With the popularity he gained from the 1992 insurrection, Chavez ran for president in the 1998 elections. As is well known, Chavez won that election, beginning a succession of mandates that lasted until his death in 2013. Crisis in Venezuela. The crisis in Venezuela refers to the political and economic turmoil that has persisted in the country since the death of Hugo Chavez and Arling Isen. In reality, Venezuelan history has long been marked by periods of popular uprisings, attempted coups, and economic instability. During the government of Rafael Caldera, Chavez's predecessor, the banking crisis led to the collapse and closure of major financial institutions between 1994 and 1996. In the Chavez era, the nationalization of energy and telecommunications companies, as well as oil fields in the Orinoco Belt operated by major multinational corporations such as Chevron and ExxonMobil, both from the United States, triggered strong reactions from these companies and the expropriation of their assets. This process took place in 2007, when Venezuela's economy was still growing, though heavily dependent on oil production and exports. At the same time, internal reforms promoted by Chavez reduced poverty and improved social indicators in the country, earning him broad popular support. Even so, changes in legislation removed restrictions on re-election, ensuring Chavez's hold on power for multiple consecutive terms, while Venezuelan democracy grew weaker. Beyond this, the government was accused of legal maneuvers and political persecution of opponents, laying the foundation for a political crisis that deepened under his successor, Nicolás Maduro. Maduro assumed Venezuela's interim presidency after Chavez's death, later being officially elected to the position. His first year in office was marked by worsening economic conditions in 2014, as oil prices plummeted from $138.54 per barrel in 2008 to $100 at the start of that year, and soon after to nearly $50. This collapse slashed Venezuela's revenues, reduced investment in the sector, and slowed national oil production by the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela, PD. Many of Venezuela's social programs had been funded by oil revenues. Another aggravating factor was the underdevelopment of other economic sectors, given the country's dependence on fossil fuels. A rapid economic decline began, forcing Venezuela to rely on imports of various goods to supply its domestic market and meet population needs. Food and basic item prices rose constantly, leading to hyperinflation that severely limited access. Hunger and food insecurity increased, as did poverty and social vulnerability. Today, just over 33% of Venezuelans still live below the poverty line. The rapid deterioration of living conditions triggered mass migration flows to neighboring countries, expanding the number of refugees seeking better opportunities in places like Colombia and Brazil. Politically, the situation was also dire. Maduro's regime violently repressed popular protests, persecuted opponents, and imposed control over Venezuela's national press. Government repression led to U.S. sanctions in 2017, worsening the country's economic outlook. Despite this, Maduro won the 2018 elections and was re-elected in 2024 for a third term. Both elections were contested by the opposition, with allegations of fraud, widespread protests, and international refusal to recognize his re-election. Meanwhile, in 2018, the then leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, declared himself Venezuela's interim president. He was recognized by countries such as the United States and Brazil, but Maduro remained in power. At the start of 2026, the Venezuelan crisis entered a new chapter. U.S. interventionist policy forcibly removed Nicolás Maduro from power. In 2025, the U.S. had attacked Venezuelan vessels in the Caribbean Sea, alleging they carried narcotics destined for the U.S. These claims culminated in a direct attack on Caracas, with the invasion of the capital and the capture of Maduro, accused of leading a drug cartel in Venezuela. However, the U.S. Department of Justice later dropped this allegation, though Maduro remains indicted for allegedly perpetuating a culture of corruption enriching drug trafficking elites in the country. Chapter 2, The Century of Oil. The 20th century brought a discovery that would forever change the country's destiny. Venezuela became one of the world's largest exporters. Caracas flourished, and the nation experienced prosperity. But wealth was not equally distributed. Military dictatorships and fragile democracies alternated in power, while social inequality grew silently. Chapter 10: Hugo Chavez and Archaïe est Century Socialism. In Ijojoba, Hugo Chavez was elected president. Charismatic and controversial, he promised to build 21st century socialism. He nationalized companies, expanded social programs, and confronted the United States. For many, Chavez represented hope. For others, he was an authoritarian leader. Yet Venezuela's dependence on oil left the country vulnerable to economic crises. Chapter 6: Nicolás Maduro and the Crisis. After Chavez's death in Arlingisen, Nicolás Maduro took power. His administration plunged Venezuela into one of the greatest crises of recent history. Hyperinflation devastated the economy. Millions of Venezuelans fled in search of survival. Long lines for food, shortages of medicine, and constant protests became routine. Accused of electoral fraud and authoritarianism, Maduro resisted international sanctions and clung to power, supported by military sectors and external allies. Chapter 5: The Operation and the Capture. In 2025, the United States intensified secret operations against the regime. In January 2026, the offensive culminated in Caracas. Special forces stormed Fort Tuna, Venezuela's largest military complex. In just 60 seconds, Nicolás Maduro was captured inside an underground bunker. The news spread worldwide. For some, it marked the end of an era of authoritarianism. For others, it was a controversial foreign intervention. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez assumed interim leadership, calling for resistance and denouncing the action as illegal. Conclusion: Maduro's capture ends more than 2 decades of Chavismo. Venezuela's future remains uncertain, caught between political reconstruction and economic challenges. Yet one certainty endures: the Venezuelan people continue to fight for freedom, dignity, and hope. If you enjoyed the video, leave your like, and until next time on Told Stories.